Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I'm Elizabeth from Gibson's Bookstore, and I am joined this evening by Annette Binder, who has her new book, The Vanishing Sky, which is a novel, and she is joining conversation by Sandell Morse, the author of The Spiral Shell. Both of these books are available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are offering curbside or pickup and in-store browsing right now. I will put a shopping link in the chat box here. But these books are both signed or book plates. Signed book plates are available with these books for purchase. Good evening, and yes, this is a Spiral Shell. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Annette, please tell us a little bit about your book.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm delighted to be here with you and with Sandell this evening. My book, The Vanishing Sky, is set in Germany during the last 6 months of World War II. And it tells the story of a mother named Etta Huber, who's really trying to hold her family together during those last few months, just as the Allies are starting to break through Germany's western fortifications. Etta's older son, Max, has come home from the Eastern Front, suffering from a mental breakdown. And as his condition deteriorates, she really struggles to hide him from the authorities because she knows that they'll take him from her if they find out how sick he really is. And at the same time, her younger son, Georg, who's 15, has run away from his post in the Hitler Youth and is trying to make his way back home to her. The book is inspired by events from my own family history. And before I launch into reading anything, I thought I would try and share a couple of photographs to give you all an idea of the place and of some of the people who really inspired me as I wrote. So fingers crossed here. All right. So the book is set in the town of Markteidenfeld on the Main River, which is in Lower Franconia, which is northern Bavaria in Germany. And for those of you who are joining us from New Hampshire or from Vermont, that area would be, I think, very reminiscent of our area here in terms of the river. The Main River is similar in a lot of ways to the Connecticut, and the terrain is very similar. And my mother, who now lives out here, always says that it reminds her very much of the old country. She says, how did I end up at the same place I started from? All right, so most of the story happens in this town. And located near the town of Markteidenfeld is the university city of Würzburg, which is a beautiful old city, has a very, very old university in it. And it was firebombed by the Royal Air Force in mid-March of 1945. About 4,000 Germans lost their lives, and many thousands more were made homeless in the attack. And the book, in many ways, was inspired by a photograph that I saw of my father. I had come across a family photo album very early in the writing, and I'd never seen any photographs of my father. And so when I found this album, I was very excited. And I saw him here, and I thought, what a little cutie he was. I had no idea he was such a cute kiddo. He was 7 here, because he was born in 1930, on the school steps. And I just thought, what a cute boy. And then the last photograph in the album, the photograph which ended the album, was my father at the age of 13 or 14 in his Hitler Youth uniform. I recognized the uniform when I saw the photograph, but it was still stunning, even though I knew he was born in 1930 and that participation in the Hitler Youth was compulsory for most German boys at that point. It's one thing to know that in the abstract, and it's another thing to see your father sort of staring back at you with those eyes that I knew so well, and still seeing him in that uniform. So my father had died when I was 16, so of course I couldn't ask him about it, and much to my regret, I didn't think of asking him anything about his life while he was alive. And he was a very quiet man who never really shared anything. So with this photo in hand, I went to my mother and asked her what she knew about my dad. And to my surprise, my mother, who had also always been very quiet about their lives in Germany, started telling me what she knew. And once we had those discussions, I was really able to imagine the Huba family, which is different from my family, but overlaps in some ways. And I was off and running in terms of writing the book. One of the stories that she told me just in passing, like many of the stories that she shared with me, it was tantalizing and it was just a mention before she went on to something else, was about an old man who used to stand by the bridge in the village and shout and make, strange gestures. He was unwell, he was mentally unwell. And she told me how cruel the children were to him. And this story, this man just stayed in my mind as I wrote the book. And much to my surprise, he found his way back into the story late in my writing, and in a scene that in some ways is a really crucial moment in the book. And so I thought that I would share that with you all. Read this scene, which is a flashback sort of toward the middle of the book. The mother, Etta, is looking back on her childhood and remembering this old man. Willi had been a toothless old man those many years ago, probably younger than Etta was now, but he seemed ancient to her then. He lived with his mother, who swept the school steps and cleaned the church. Etta could hear him still, laughing as he stood there by the bridge and talking nonsense to the passers-by. He would chase the river ducks sometimes too and flap his arms, and some days he was unhappy and pulled at his hair. He wasn't right in the head, her mother had told her once. He was made in the sauce. It was his parents' drunkenness that caused his problems. He always had his book under his arm, its cover tattered and stained from the dirt on his hands. He couldn't read, everybody knew this, but he carried it anyway, maybe because he liked the weight of it or the feel of its embossed leather binding. It was spring when she saw him last. The sun was setting behind the hills and the river looked golden in the failing light. The girls in the group had licorice ropes and their lips were red as cherries. The oldest Reisig boy smiled at the others and stepped toward Willi. He gestured toward the book in the old man's hand. "Come on, Willi, let me see your book," he said. "It's such a nice book, much nicer than our old school books." He leaned in close and smiled at Willi, and Etta felt uneasy when she saw the look on the boy's face. Willi flashed a toothless smile, pleased perhaps that someone had noticed his fine book. The boy pounced then, fast as a tiger the way he snatched it from Willi's hand. Willi cried in anger and in sorrow, but there was nothing he could do. He was too slow for the boys. They tossed it back and forth to Willi's side and over his head. The girls in the group were laughing at the sorry sight and clapping their hands. The boys threw the book in ever more elaborate ways, between their legs and from behind their backs, then dangling it in front of Willi, only to tear it from his hand. Etta held her satchel close against her chest and watched the old man chase the boys, first one way, then the other. "Stop," Willi said, and he fell to his knees, his breath ragged. "It's mine," he said, looking around at all of them. "It's from my mother, that book." And he raised his arms and cried out, a horrible wounded sound that came from deep inside his chest. Etta wanted to shout out, to tell them to stop the game because they were hurting the old man and for no reason, but the words didn't come. Ilse stood beside her, holding her licorice twists tight in both fists, and their eyes met. Ilse shook her head and turned to go. Etta watched her walk away, and though she wanted to join her friend, something kept her there. The other girls had stopped laughing now and were growing impatient with the game, but the boys kept at it. "Come on, old man," one of them said. "Come and take it, it's right here." The book flew high into the air. The pages had started to come undone and fluttered like leaves into the water. Willi cried out and pushed himself up from the mud. He waded into the river. The sun shone on his head and haloed his hair, those sorry tufts he had. Etta shielded her eyes. The sun, the water, the vanishing sky between the trees. She saw only Willi. She should have tried to help him, but she stood there with her classmates and did nothing. He reached for the pages, slapping his palms against the water, and it happened quickly then. Maybe he slipped in the mud, or maybe it just became too deep for him. They watched as he went under. Even the boys had gone quiet now. Willi came up twice, waving his arms as if in greeting, and then he was gone. They stood still for a moment, all of them. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the bank, and then the church bells began to ring, signaling that it was 5 o'clock already and time to go home. The sound of the bells brought them back to themselves, and they ran, arms outstretched, each of them going in a different direction, some crossing the bridge and others heading toward the town center. But Etta didn't move. She stayed there long after they had gone. She watched the muddy water. She'd seen a horse wash ashore once, half rotten and swollen to bursting from its time in the river. She willed herself to cry for Willy, who was so close to where she stood, but unreachable now. She blinked, but the tears wouldn't come. Etta had turned to go when she saw the book, pressed face down into the mud where the boys had left it. She bent down to look. The binding was broken, but most of the pages were still intact. It was a history book about the Romans and the Greeks, written in the old German script they had to learn at school, each chapter beginning with enormous scrolling letters as intricate as a wood carving. She couldn't leave it there in the dirt. It wasn't right, not when he'd loved it and fought so hard to get it back, and so she set it inside her satchel. Her mother scolded her when she got home. "Look how red your fingers are," she told Etta. "Look how sticky from the candy." After the dishes were washed and her mother was busy down in the cellar, Etta wiped the pages clean, and the tears came then, and great rasping sobs that shook her chest and caught inside her throat. They never spoke of old Willy again, not weeks later when some fishermen caught him in the ropes down by the docks, or when his mother fell from the church steps in her grief. They had done something wrong, wrong beyond measure, and it could not be righted in the telling. Like so many of my mother's stories that found its way in, I relied on journals from my great-grandfather, from stories from my aunt. And then when I exhausted sort of what my family could really tell me about my father and realized that in many ways he would always be a mystery to me, I went to secondary sources and researched everything I could about the Hitler Youth and about Germany of the era. And then I let it all go and I just wrote the story and stayed with the characters for the duration to see where they would lead me.
Annette, that is absolutely strikingly beautiful. I have to say, I absolutely love, love, love this book. It will be one of my all-time favorites. It is amazing. And I was really struck by that section that you chose to read. It's heartbreaking, it's beautiful. And that last line, I won't going to read it because I don't want to mess it up. They had done something wrong beyond measure, and it could not be righted in the telling. And that says to me that there's so much more going on here than just children taunting an old man. And the children keep one another silent and nobody speaks of it again. And it becomes a collective guilt, which is, of course, a major theme in the book and a major theme in many, many books about the Second World War and all of the secrets that are held. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that was an idea that preoccupied me very much as I wrote, the sort of idea of silence, how people keep the silence, and how once the silence pervades a group like that, people start to internalize it, and it becomes hard even to think thoughts that go against the sort of agreement to remain silent. I think people internalize the silence. And so some of my characters really grapple. I mean, within the family, you have the mother Etta, who remembers people who've disappeared. You have her husband Josef, who has a very different point of view, is much more nationalistic and really wanting to defend Germany, especially against the Bolsheviks who are going to be coming in. You have the two sons who are each struggling in different ways with the expectations and the demands of the regime. And within it all, you have this silence and people really keeping their own secrets. People who live side by side and have known each other for 40 years still don't really know each other terribly well and are surprised by what they find out about each other.
Yes, and of course, as a writer and a Jewish person and who has written about the Second World War from the Jewish point of view, taking place a lot in France, my antenna were up. So I really wanted to see, well, how is she going to handle this? And you were masterful. I must say that. I was absolutely stunned by the way people knew and didn't know, and people pretended to know and maybe pretended not to know. And Etta, particularly, I think she worked so hard not to know. And Joseph was totally, he was a soldier, he was a warrior, and he was going to do his job for his country no matter what. And he wanted more than anything for his boys to be warriors as well. And Max ends up bringing home the medals that his father never brought home from the First World War. And Georg is just such a disappointment to his father. He's fat, he's soft, and there's where he likes poetry, he likes languages. He does not want to be a soldier, he wants to be a scholar. And there's a moment that I love when Georg thinks back, and you write, his father was a teacher, not an alchemist. All his efforts were bound to fail. And Georg has this sensitivity that makes him doubt the propaganda that he's hearing. And it also sets us up for what happens next in the book, beyond in the book. But there's also something I wanted to mention that I haven't seen mentioned too much, and that is there is a very tender and sweet love affair between Georg and Muller. And Muller is the ideal Hitler youth. He's strong, he's brave, he is blonde, he's tall, and his eyes are so light blue that when a doctor comes to compare his eyes to these eyes that he has, samples that he has with them, there's no match. And from that moment on, Georg thinks of Muller as having gray eyes. And it's Muller who goes to the front first, and it's Georg who follows later. And would you read that passage about Georg and when he's on his way to the front?
Absolutely. That is sort of the passage that sets Georg's story in motion. The novel is sort of the intertwined stories of Etta and then Georg sort of back and forth. And when Georg loses Müller like that, he is sent just for a very short jaunt to work on the West Wall up north, and he takes his chance and jumps. Okay. The road was pocked from the treads and the rocks and the sand they threw in wintertime. The truck was covered only with canvas, and the wind blew through the slits. They couldn't sleep at first with all the bouncing. They closed their eyes anyway, and a few boys covered their heads with blankets. Georg sat near the front and held the canvas open to see. There were men walking alongside the road. They leaned forward into the wind, and a few had fallen and lay on their backs. Farther on, 2 men knelt in the dirt, their hands held high, and a man stood over them with his rifle. Georg closed his eyes. They should have left weeks ago. He shouldn't have listened when Müller said no. They'd be far from the buckets now. Müller would be alive still and striking his deals. He always found what he was looking for: cigarettes and chocolate, folding knives and old magazines. He knew just where to look, and if anybody asked how, he set his finger to his lips. Georg let the canvas drop. He turned first to one side and then to the other, and he remembered his bed at home. How soft the mattress was and how cool the pillow felt when he first lay down. The hallway clock ticking outside his door, and Kaspar sleeping in his covered cage, and Moody was probably still working in the kitchen. The motion of the truck rocked him to sleep, and he saw his house again. The cemetery and the Gasthaus and the schoolhouse with its leaded windows. He was flying over them, and how small the buildings looked from above, how small the half-timbered houses. Max was there beside him. He was home from school, and they were floating together, and they rose and rose, and they broke through the clouds. Don't be afraid, his brother told him, and they were freer than they'd ever been or would ever be again. The sky was clear when Georg awoke. The truck was moving more slowly over the ruts. He looked out through the canvas. There was no moon shining and no lights in the field. The darkness outside was a palpable thing. so real that he could feel it press against his skin like water, and the weight of it made it hard to breathe. He wanted to reach outside and feel the air. He wanted to spread it with his fingers, just like Moses spread the sea. The others were still sleeping. They didn't stir when he rose from his spot. He leaned over to look through the opening into the road below, which was black like a river and promised to pull him down to itself. He touched the pouch inside his shirt and felt the ladies there giving him luck. He took a breath, a deep breath of that cold, dark air, and he jumped.
Thank you. Well, so I think most of us who write truly love language, and every word in this book seems so carefully chosen to me, and every sentence, and it is absolutely beautiful. And I really felt as if that prose were so musical and flowing in such a way that I as a reader simply fell down into it. And I just wanted to stay there and be with it. And we have that going on. And then we have your absolutely deep, deep understanding of character and the way you've gotten so deeply into each character and build that throughout the novel. And then we've got all your meticulous research. And I, for one, was struck by your descriptions of the bombings. And I think there's one place where you kind of say like the air rose all at once. And I would love it if you would share with us some of the research that you did. How did you find out about these bombings? And you know so much about the Western Front and where everybody was and when. So would you share a little bit of that with us?
Yes, to research the Allied bombings of the German cities, I really needed to find a lot of primary sources, a lot of sources in the German of people who survived the fire bombings and described what it was like, and particularly in the city that I was focused on, the city of Würzburg, you know. And so there were some really helpful sources in both English and in German talking about what it was like to see the city just blow like that, you know, with the incendiary bombs that were used. Really everything just melted. The copper would melt from the spires and people were incinerated. If they stayed down in the shelters below, the gases from the boilers and from the explosions would get them down in the shelters. And so it doesn't really matter where you were. If you were in the area that was targeted, it was very, very unlikely to survive at all. So mostly it was German sources from the 50s. I actually found the city of Würzburg city chronicle that came out in 1946 that described the firebombing in excruciating detail, and also what was done right afterwards in terms of dealing with the numbers of bodies and sort of, you know, what they had to do. So it was an absolute invaluable source. eBay saved me many times when it came to finding a lot of those books.
I found that in my own work that the Allied bombings were a pretty well kept secret for the most part, and the destruction that they caused to civilian populations in France, I know, as well as and in Germany. And you mentioned earlier tonight about Max, and you mentioned that Etta was afraid he would be taken away. And there's a big they there that will come for him. And he does end up in this particular hospital. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, that was actually not something that I knew about this beautiful city of Würzburg that my parents always described in such, you know, it's such a beautiful city, so historic. But there was, Würzburg was one of the centers of the German program to systematically starve and murder mentally ill people with MS. The university psychiatric clinic in particular was one place where mentally ill people were starved to death. And then their bodies donated to the medical school for use in dissection. So I had already written a big part of that story when I actually found that Würzburg was one of the centers of that. and that went on through to the very end of the war. Mentally ill people, people with other heritable diseases were still being systematically targeted in Würzburg and in many other German cities.
You've chosen to focus on the end of the war because it's a really particularly heartbreaking time for Germany. And there are a few moments when you talk about toward the very end, it's the old men who surrender, and it's the children, the young boys, 12, 13, 14, who are the ones who will fight to the end. And they believe until the end that there's a secret weapon, that there's something that's going to save them. And I am really interested in hearing about your thoughts about that. I mean, what is it that would keep the parents even, from trying to protect their children in that way?
Well, I think that's one of the real of the whole pyramid of evils. That is definitely one of them. Is that the German regime sort of systematically focused on the younger generation, and the indoctrination was so intense and so thorough that there was often a rift between the younger boys who were adamantly pro-regime and wanted to defend it to the very last, and would think that dying for that would be the most noble of deaths, and their parents who were unable to prevent that indoctrination, and would actually sometimes the boys or the girls in some cases would inform on the parents. If the parents expressed any doubts, even the home became a place where you couldn't express yourself. You had to maintain that silence because someone very close to you could be the one who would inform on you.
Right. And you do that so beautifully. And you let us know that as readers, we understand that there needs to be a reckoning. And you recognize that as a writer as well, that there's no justification here. There is pain, and there is horror, and there is sadness, and there's heartbreak. And if we only, if we know these things, bring them into the light, can we possibly move forward, I think. So that's why I'm such an absolutely great admirer, because the writing is absolutely beautiful, and the sensibility is wonderful, and it's a very wise book as well. So it's really good. So do you think, Elizabeth, we can open up for questions? Do we have any questions?
Not yet, but if anybody has any questions that they've been sitting on that they would like to ask Annette, now's the time to type them out. To our audience members, Annette, I do have a question. This is a difficult book to read, but was there any hopeful spark in the book that you found? I mean, it's hard to feel hope about such a situation, but was there a hopeful part that you did enjoy writing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways it's a story of resistance on a small scale. I mean, I think the mother, Etta, would do absolutely anything to help her boys, absolutely anything. And so you have a mother in the most difficult time imaginable, sort of resisting the regime as best she can and trying to save her son. And you have Georg, who in many ways, because of his own temperament and because of the boy that he loves, is able to resist the indoctrination as well. And so you see resistance. And I mean, I like to think that it's threaded with hope throughout, that it's not just this total downer and, destruction throughout. It's threaded with hope, and it's threaded with small acts of kindness and resistance. So I think, but the whole book, I mean, in some ways I felt so close to these characters that when bad things would happen to them, it sort of was hard. I felt it, it's like something happening to my own family member, because the way I wrote it was character first. I mean, I always say, I think of the writer as a Ouija board, and you sort of need to tap into your characters and then let them write the story for you. And so that's very much what I did. I did not outline ahead of time. I had a very general idea of where it was going, but I didn't outline it until I had the first draft. And then I actually sat down and outlined it to see what I had. It was all sort of character driven, and they surprised me at almost every turn, which was one of the great pleasures of writing it.
So you mentioned your mother is still with us. Has
She is. Yes, my mother has read it. She read a very early draft and has been one of my biggest supporters. You know, both my parents are German. Obviously, I came to the U.S. when I was a kid, but my mother has always been one of my biggest supporters. From my earliest age, I remember her telling me, "You have a very good vocabulary," you know, and so sort of still a running joke between us, me and my vocabulary. But no, she loves the book and is a huge supporter of the book.
What do you think your father would have thought of it?
You know, that is such a good question. And I ask myself that. He was such a quiet man, not in a bad way. I mean, there's a German word, Gemütlichkeit, which means a sort of contented tranquility. And our house was very gemütlich, always, but very quiet. And so I have no idea. I mean, I have a feeling if he read it, he wouldn't really tell me very much. I hope that he would be proud, you know, and that he would see some truth in the story, and that it would ring true for him. And that maybe it would give us a chance to sort of talk about his own life in that way. I mean, in some ways, I asked the questions and then I had to answer them for myself in the writing because he wasn't around to answer them for me.
That kind of quiet is so present in so many of the characters as well. And as you mentioned, the acts of kindness, it's Ilse, that scene strikes me where Ilse takes Etta downstairs to show her a basement full of possessions, and there's silver and there's china. And the Jews in the village came to her and asked her if she would keep these until they returned. And she says, you know, this one came and then that one came. And then she said, if I take one, how can I refuse another? And she eventually believes that they're not coming back, but she's keeping their things for them. And I thought that was very touching.
Yeah, she's polishing their silver and sort of just keeping those things. It's just her. She lives alone, and it's just her these objects in the cellar. You know, and again, it's a secret that she kept. I mean, she only revealed that to Etta. You know, they'd known each other for 40 years, and she'd never told her about that.
Annette, what is the town like today?
You know, last time I was there, it was probably when I was 13 or 14. I deliberately did not want to go back to Germany to research this book. I wanted to sort of have it in my head the way it might have been then, and not see it with internet cafes or whatever would have been there, you know, 15 years ago when I was really writing it. But it's still a small town. Würzburg is still a beautiful university town. Last time I went, I visited my grandmother, and that would be my father's mother. We were a little bit distant, you know, because we were the only part of the family that came to the United States. But we tried to go back every year when I was little. Either my mother or my father would go back to visit the grandparents.
So if there are any audience questions, we are available to answer them now. Annette, do you have anything in the works right now for a next piece?
Yes, I've been working on a novel that's based on one of my short stories. It's very different, although it does have historical components as well. It's based on a short story called Dead Languages, in which a 3-year-old boy has been silent his entire life. And when he finally does start speaking, he speaks only ancient Greek. And so the parents are trying to figure out what is going on with this child. And so there's a big historical component to it. And I was a classics major in college, so it's been a joy going back to ancient Greek and, you know, sort of imagining that story. Again, it's always character driven. So, you know, I had a sense of where I was going, but I let the character surprise me at every instance.
So Sandell, your book, The Spiral Shell, is set is not a novel, but
No.
it's about your family history and World War II and France, but the Jewish side of the war. What were your thoughts as you were reading this book?
Well, as I said, I was truly looking for how Annette would treat the subject of Jews. Okay, sorry. So I was really curious as to how she would treat that, and I think she did an absolutely wonderful job. My book is very different in that I'm actually on my own spiritual journey, but I am interviewing older women who have lived through that war, and they one in particular um, turn that off. One in particular worked in a secret house in Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne and protected Jewish refugee children. So what struck me about that, and what struck me also about Annette's book, was that there was a dailiness to life that everybody had to live. And in Annette's book, Etta is very concerned about feeding her family, and she's very upset because she has only cabbage and potatoes and blood first, whatever. And Annette was very, very concerned about feeding the children in the house. And she would go to the butcher. And I think that she flirted with the butcher because the butcher would give her a little bit of meat. And they would have to go in further into the countryside to find food. So one thing Annette and I didn't talk about, but that is also a major theme in her book, is food. And food is also a major theme in my book, because food in Jewish tradition is the way we express love, and it's the way we have tremendous rituals around food. And our Jewish holidays have certain foods that we eat. And in Annette's book, there's a similar vein with food and preparing food for the family and for celebration. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think food, or the lack of it, is such a major theme. Like, what do you do? How do you manage to get what you need? And part of that came from my mother, who would tell me when she was really hungry as a 5-year-old, as a 6-year-old, she would eat a little bit of yeast to sort of puff up her belly so that it would take the edge off the pangs. If people did not have relatives in the countryside, people who were farmers in their family, a lot of them went quite hungry by the end of the war in Germany. I mean, you had your ration coupons, but they didn't do any good if there was nothing to get with them. So, and Blutwurst, which is like blood sausage, is literally what it sounds like. I mean, that was one of the things that she ate, a lot of blood sausage and beets. And to this day, she still can't stand beets. I love beets. We're growing beets in our garden. And when I tell her we're growing beets, she's like, oh, disgusting. I can't, but it's one of those memories. The idea of an orange is just the most exotic, exquisite thing in the world to some of these characters. And that's, again, from my mother, who, when she and my father first went to Canada and she was able to get little orange slices in the cans, she just, my father said, eat as many as you like. And it was just the biggest gift in the world. So it's sort of day-to-day, the texture of day-to-day life, and the importance of food, and how its absence sort of looms large. Just this feeling of deprivation at that point, I think, molds a lot of the characters.
And then I have to add one thing. In one of my interviews in the book is with Gerhard Schneider, who is a man who lived through the war, and he would be probably a contemporary, maybe a year or two younger than I am, contemporary of your mother's and mine. And he tells me about fleeing to the countryside, and there was a time when the Allies, the Americans, were approaching, and there was a bomb that hit the house where he was hiding, and his aunt was wounded quite badly, and he was very superficially wounded, but they were protecting an American soldier. And the soldier called in the Red Cross, and they went to the hospital, and someone handed him an orange. And he said it was the first time that he had ever tasted an orange, and he has never forgotten that.
Mm-hmm.
And in France as well, food was a problem for the villagers because it was the invading army, which was the German army, that took all of the food for their troops and left the population starving. So it's people all over who are the ones that suffer the most from war.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. I think it's so easy looking back from the vantage point of 75 years, now to sort of think that the German population or any one population is monolithic. But within that, you're going to have some people who rabidly supported the hateful regime and its goals. And you have other people who actively resisted heroically. And then you're going to have all the people in the middle who might have a whole range of feelings about the regime. They might hate it, but be too frightened to do anything about it. They might be doubtful, they might have doubts, but be in denial about what they might actually know.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have some who are nationalists, but anti-Hitler, but they just don't want, the Russians coming through. And so you have this complexity. And when we look at it from our vantage point, it just looks flat. You see a rally and you think, oh, everyone in Germany must have supported, or everyone in, so many Germans were heroic resistors because you have these amazingly brave people who risked everything. But the reality is much more complex. And, it's that sort of complexity that appealed to me that I really wanted to explore. The people who might have known but doubted, were in denial about it, the people who resisted on a small scale, that was really intriguing to me. How do you live with yourself if you suspect something but fail to act? Those sorts of questions really preoccupied me as I wrote.
And those were my questions as well. So, yes.
Annette, we do have a question from Janine who wants to know, what was the reason your family came to the U.S. when you were young?
My parents' story is I can never sort of do it in a nutshell, because what happened is my father left Germany as soon as he could. He left when he was 20 years old and went to Northern Canada and worked in a gold mine, actually, in Northern Ontario. And he went back for the first time to Germany in 1956 on vacation and met my mother, who was only 16. They fell in love, got married, went back to Canada, then went back to Germany, where I was born, and then came to the United States permanently. And my father worked as a soldier in the US military and actually served in Vietnam. So he went from the Hitler Youth as a boy to being in the US Army and serving in Vietnam.
So do you have many stories from your mother's youth? And this story, of course, follows roughly your father, although not. What are your mother's different stories from her youth in Germany?
Mostly what it was just extreme privation. I mean, a lot of stories about how hungry she was. She does remember the surrender, when the Germans would put the white sheets out of the windows and the American troops came through her part of Germany. And she remembers sort of going up to the American soldiers and getting rations, getting like the little marmalades or getting like the little sugar packets, and running home overjoyed at having gotten these things. She said the American soldiers liked the little kids and would give them things from their ration packs. But my mother really, when she came to the US, she sort of put all of that behind her and only started talking to me when I started asking her very specifically. I think her childhood in many ways was more difficult still than my father's was. She came from a family that had fewer resources financially. Her father died right after the war. And so I think her childhood was very much marred by the destruction of Germany in terms of opportunities for her. Just weren't there. And for girls in general at that point in Germany, I think the opportunities weren't there. She did very well in school, but she wasn't able to go to the gymnasium, which is the German sort of higher high school, you know, the high school for kids who are college bound. She had the test scores, but they couldn't afford the train fare to get her to the gymnasium. So in many ways, I think her life in Germany was very curtailed. And when she came to the US, all of a sudden it opened for her, and especially through me, I think she sort of realized anything would be possible, you know, for my daughter. If not for me in my time, it's now possible for my daughter.
Well, that's about what we have time for this evening. Thank you, the two of you, for joining us. Any final thoughts as we close out the event?
Annette?
Just a huge thank you to Gibson's, and for those of you who are joining us. If you don't buy my book or you don't buy Sandell's book, please buy a book or something, because independent bookstores are so amazing and they bring readers and writers together in a way that nobody else can. So I'm just hugely appreciative.
Well,
And I am as well. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and Gibson's.
Thank you to the two of you as well. It has been a delight to hear from the both of you this evening. And a reminder to our audience, Gibson's does have copies of The Vanishing Sky and The Spiral Shell at Gibson's Bookstore. And we are open for browsing traffic, but we also are still shipping and doing curbside very happily. We're happy to do that for you. Thank you very much, everybody, this evening. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.